an obscure nobleman who accurately predicted World War II 30 years early, the rise of China a century earlier, and who helped China become a republic, ending thousands of years of dynasties. The young adventurer Homer Lea was a military strategist, writer, and political activist born in 1876 and who died in 1912. Known for his prophetic visions and innovative strategies, particularly related to geopolitics and international relations. Lea gained recognition with the publication of his most influential book titled The Valor of Ignorance, released in 1909. In today's video, we will look at the theory of Homer Lea, a geopolitical thinker unknown to most geopolitics enthusiasts, but who had a profound and enormous influence on the world, as we know it today. But before that, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share the video with everyone you know, so that I can keep bringing you real geopolitics content. Your support is absolutely essential for the continuation of the Geopolitica Mundial channel. My name is Adrián Peta, and this is Geopolitica Mundial. To understand Homer Lea's viewpoint, we must combine strategic, military, and geopolitical analysis. In two books that he wrote, The Day of Saxo in 1912 and the more famous one, The Valor of Ignorance, from 1909. Homer Lea says that physical and military strength are fundamental elements for the existence and prosperity of a nation. Just as a man's physical vigor is like this, it is equated to the military strength of nations, reinforcing that the capacity for defense and conquest is essential for the growth and success of a country. He then points out that ideals, laws, and constitutions are only temporary manifestations and exist only as long as that vital force remains. And just as physical strength reaches its peak in a man's maturity, a nation's military conquests mark the peak of its physical greatness. For him, the decline of physical strength in an individual indicates illness or old age, just like the decrease of military strength in a nation. It marks its decline. Therefore, if there is no national renaissance, decline will set in and the result will inevitably be grim, as happened with countless nations that, because of their vanity, failed to foresee their own downfall and the collapse of their fragile government structures. He then analyzes the history of humanity, revealing that over a cycle of approximately 3,400 years, there have been less than 234 years of peace, with nations succeeding one another, with a sequence of their rise, decline, and fall, all of which were consequences. Built by architects who were generals, masons who were soldiers, trowels that were swords, and with stones that were the ruins of decaying states. Their greatness always aligned with their military strength and resulting expansion. These nations reached their greatest heights just as their expansion was ending, because he believes that there is no stagnation in the life of an individual or in the life of a nation. Thus, national existence is governed by an unchanging law. The borders of political entities never remain stationary. They must either expand or shrink. He explains that the history of China's political development resembles the history of other nations, both in the West and in the East. China built its own progress and civilization without relying on other civilizations in the world. But China also experienced times of physical vigor and determination. China would be made up of political units that alternate between decline and rebirth throughout its existence. But according to him, there is a difference between China and others, which is the fact that it was lucky to have a natural environment that protected it and favored its continuity. Over the centuries, the inaccessible mountains of the Himalayas, the uninhabitable deserts of Gobi and Zamo, impenetrable forests in Siberia and southern Nubia, steppes hostile to human presence, and relatively empty seas all contributed to its isolation. In its defense and in the preservation of the Chinese race throughout its historical continuity. Until the 19th century, China would be practically unreachable for European nations. It was considered a mythical kingdom called Katai, located somewhere among the jewels of the Eastern Sea. Thus, from that century, the 19th century, the situation would change drastically, with China facing increasingly complex challenges. Now, threats came not just from the north, but also the east, south, and west. European powers and Japan became influential threats to China's existence and greatness. These powers established their own colonies in China and sought to divide and conquer the country. Romer argues that just as individuals cannot conceive of their own death, nations also cannot comprehend their own extinction, even when it seems inevitable. He notes that the American Republic's history has followed the same elemental forces that shaped and governed other nations. After all, the country was built through fighting and conquering defenseless tribes, just as other nations did before it. But America's conquests were made over nations and aborigines who were disproportionately weaker, which made its wars destructive. Instead of promoting quality military concepts, in other words, the concept of war in the American armed forces developed not by facing serious threats, but by facing much weaker threats. So, would we have the difference between industrialism and commercialism? And how can these two elements affect the destiny of a nation? He describes industrialism as the development of industries and the potential wealth of a nation. He is considered incidental to national progress, and not the goal of national greatness. But we also have commercialism, which is the use of industrialism for the gratification of individual greed. While industrialism is the work of a people to supply the needs of humanity, commercialism is the exploitation of that industrialism for personal benefit. He brings up this discussion to get to the question of the importance of military development. Because while industrialism is related to the considered an instrument of activity, he is considered one of activity, he is an instrument of activity. He went crazy, he is considered a president, or he is considered president, or he went crazy. He lost the Anglo-Saxon planning. But what would those dangers be that would threaten the United States and the British Empire in Homer's view? And for that, he describes the geopolitical scenario of the time. In The Day of the Saxon from 1912, he separates the interests of the Saxons, more specifically the English, into key areas: America, India, the Pacific, East Asia, Russia, and Europe. About America, he says that the future of the political relationship between the British Empire and America will be determined by the convergence of Canadian interests, American interests, and European interests, which would in fact happen in World War II when these three countries aligned because of a threat arising in Europe. Regarding India, he is prophetic. If it weren't for India, the British nation would be confined to the United Kingdom and America. As long as England dominates India, its position as an empire will remain unchallenged. That's why he expresses concern about possible Indian nationalism, where he says that losing India would be a vital blow to the British Empire. Speaking about the strategic and political importance of India, he states that retaining India depends on the military supremacy of the empire, both in India and on its borders. He argues that the loss of India could be more damaging to the British Empire, even more so than a direct attack on the British Isles. He highlights the importance of India as a central strategic position in Asia and Africa, establishing 11 strategic triangles that define this. The first arise from what he calls the laws of political and military strategy, which offer offensive, defensive, and total regional security. To the west, he includes Arabia and the east coast of Africa. From Aden to Cape Town in the south, including the entire Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, Australia, and New Zealand, and to the east, the Malay Peninsula and the settlements of the Strait of Malacca. These 11 strategic triangles have, outside of India, 3 subsidiary centers. The first, Asia Minor, being the center of the Western Sphere, the Seychelles Triangle. Mauricio Diego Garcia is the Southern Sphere center and Singapore is the Eastern center. And because of that, he has shown in the book a concern regarding a resurgence of Indian nationalism under British rule, and how the growth of nationalism would eventually lead to the resurgence of militancy. Few know that Lea Homer was widely read in Japan, particularly by the Imperial Military High Command. The strategies of the Japanese Empire were based on the theories of Mahan and Lea Homer himself. And not by chance, because the Japanese, through their highly efficient espionage services, would try to encourage Indian nationalism as a way to weaken the British position in Asia. Because they knew that if India was lost by the British, London's days as a global superpower would be numbered. That turned out to be prophetic because even though the Japanese didn't achieve it, they at least managed to encourage it. So that by the start of the Cold War, the loss of India would lead England to lose its status as an empire in the Pacific. He mentions the importance of maintaining political and military balance. He says that the defense of Australasia, that is Australia and New Zealand, depends entirely on the integrity and continuity of the British Empire. As long as the empire remains, the security of Australasia would be guaranteed, but if the empire were lost, Saxon domination in the South Pacific would also come to an end. He expresses concern about the population expansion in Asia towards Australasia and the need for military defense to prevent Asian immigration, specifically Chinese and Japanese. He argues that Australasia's defensive capability alone would not be enough to prevent the seizure of its territories by any power that controlled the seas in the region. In East Asia, he criticizes the alliance between the British Empire and Japan, arguing that this alliance resulted in consequences from it. He compares the rise of Japan to the rise of England. He emphasizes that maritime control is fundamental for the defense and expansion of an insular power, that is, an island. He predicts that Japan would have a significant role in Asia and the Pacific, and that its control over the Pacific would become increasingly absolute, while British control over the Atlantic would become increasingly uncertain. Basically, he described the world of 1940 31 years earlier, because he believed that the Japanese Empire would want to extend its maritime borders east of the Hawaiian Islands and south of the Philippines, and that the positions of the British Empire from Hong Kong, Singapore, and Australasia were already in the hands of the Japanese in case of war. Also because in World War II, when the British Empire was defeated, it quickly lost Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Furthermore, he predicted that Japan would prioritize taking the Philippines because by conquering that region, Japan would complete its chain of island fortresses. From the Kamchatka Peninsula to the Indian Ocean, with which it would connect to Asia from the west, this was exactly the strategy that Japan tried in World War II. But besides Japan, he also shows concern about Russia, which for him is an unstable empire expanding and growing over the centuries. Its expansion does not depend on luck, but rather is the result of a predetermined plan. He mentions how, during the 18th century, Russia consolidated its borders and continued with its expansion plan, which had been decided during the 17th century. Through a series of wars and conquests, Russia achieved its expansion goals in strategic directions. It sought to expand northwest to conquer Swedish territories in the Baltic region, west to obtain parts of Poland, south to gain access to the Black Sea and create instability in Turkey, and southeast to conquer the Caspian Sea and the Caucasus. Finally, Russia expanded toward the Pacific, annexing territories such as Amur, Ussuri, Kamchatka, and the Kwangtung Peninsula. What made Russia become a power both in Europe and in Asia? He mentions how Russia was not only efficient in expanding its territory, but also in consolidating its conquests, unifying all these vast regions into a single empire. And given the defeat to Japan in 1905, its establishment in Asia and Germany, establishing in the Bosphorus and Eastern Europe, Russia would eventually march south through Persia, where it would reach India, the weak point of the British Empire. And as I said, he mentions Germany as a major concern, seeing that in his future, that is 1912, a war between the British Empire and the German Empire would be inevitable, which would actually happen just 2 years later in the First World War. He describes the future conflict as constant. He says that Germany, like other nations, is subject to what he calls forces and influences that shape its existence and development. One of these influences is the political environment in which the nation is situated. For the expansion of a nation occurs toward areas where the power of resistance is lower and the motivation for expansion is greater. That's why Denmark, being one of the strategic spheres of Europe, would be essential for Germanic power. Next would be the Netherlands, which with its ports would give Germany the opportunity to attack the British Isles. From there, the Germans would also acquire the Dutch colonial possessions, establishing German power in the east, on the northern coast of South America, and on the Dutch islands in the southern part of the Caribbean Sea, thus isolating English power. And finally, Austria, which would give the Teutonic projection over the Mediterranean and Asia Minor, which is present-day Turkey. In fact, he mentions how Austrian sovereignty seemed to be nearing a great end and that it would probably be annexed soon. So we have prophetically the rise of the three powers that would mark the end of the British Empire. The rise of Germany in Western Eurasia, the rise of Japan in East Asia, and Russia pressing toward India. The Achilles heel of the Saxons, which basically is the prediction of World War I with Germany, which by itself was enough to erode the British Empire. The prediction of World War II with Germany and Japan, which would dismantle the British Empire. And finally, the Cold War against Russia or the Soviet Union, which would ultimately bury the British Empire. But did it seem, in his view, that England would make it through these struggles in the future? He also foresaw how the geopolitical situation in the Pacific was pushing toward a future war between Japan and the United States. He mentions how, just a few decades earlier, Japan was practically a myth and the German Empire was merely a geographical possibility. But that by then they were already considered equals and, in many aspects, even superior in strength. And this only happened because they did not become excessively dependent on industrialism. But from the time of Bismarck until that moment, they recognized the unchangeability of these laws. And they have maintained and are continually preparing to maintain in the future the balance between their industrial expansion and political development. He says that if Germany and Japan keep resisting what he calls deteriorating influences like feminism and political charlatanism, which he doesn't clearly define, they would soon end up forming an alliance to divide the world between them. Remember, he says this 31 years before the tripartite pact between Japan, Germany, and Italy. So, this inevitable war between Japan and the United States is seen by him as the consequence of a geopolitical calculation. The exit of China as a regional power because of the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894 where Japan won, the exit of Russia as a possible actor in the Pacific because of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905 where Japan also won, and this gradual elimination of England and the European balance in 1905. In other words, only two actors were left to dominate the Asian area of the Pacific. And for him, the commercial interdependence between the two countries, the United States and Japan, would not be enough to prevent a war. Thus we notice that, in his thesis, he summarizes that nations project their external power where there is less resistance and greater importance, that they go through cycles of birth, strengthening, and eventually decline, unless there is a rebirth, and that there is a kind of geopolitical natural selection because the elimination of smaller regional powers leads to two larger actors remaining, who will eventually collide directly in a war. And he in his tactical map basically demonstrates the importance of the Rhineland, which would later be described by Spikeman as the most important area, with Germany and Japan pressing in from the sides while Russia pushes from the inside toward the south, and the loss of India as a factor that would lead to the collapse of the British Empire. Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget to share the video with everyone you know. Give it a like and subscribe. If you aren't subscribed, activate the notification bell. And if you really want to stay up to date with the channel's news, join our Telegram group where I'm always posting important news or announcements related to the channel. Hugs, see you next video.